So now the time has finally come in my beautiful backyard, because it's a nice sunny day today, to make the video that I've been threatening to do for quite a while now, and that is about bayonets for the VZ58 rifle. Now I can't tell you exactly why I felt the need to collect all of the variations of bayonet for the VZ58, other than I really like the VZ58. It's a fantastic rifle. And so when I discovered that there were so many iterations of the bayonet for this rifle, well, I had to have them. Not an easy or cheap task to do, but I mostly did it. I'll get later to the one variation I've been looking for that I just cannot find. And there's a good reason why they are very hard to find and why I have not seen one up for sale as of late. But in this video, I'm going to go over the variations of the VZ58 bayonet, why there are so many variations, and the order in which those variations were developed. And also, we're going to be going over scabbards and sheaths that they were used for throughout the VZ58 service life, from the early 60s all the way up until the global war on terror. It's so mid to late 2000s. But first, you have to start off with the context for why this bayonet exists in the first place. And that would be because this rifle exists. But why does this rifle exist? So if you rewind for a bit back to the early 1950s, Czechoslovakia, under a new communist regime at the time, had adopted the VZ52 rifle, which I will embed an image of because unfortunately I don't have one. That was their new semi-automatic rifle to replace their rather outdated VZ24s, which I have inside but didn't feel like bringing out here. And the VZ24 had its own bayonet, which was your typical Mauser type bayonet that they got when they got the tooling to make 98 Mausers with the VZ24. It was a rather long, about 11 inches, inverted blade bayonet, so the blade for the bayonet was actually on top when you mount it, pointed towards the muzzle rather than on the bottom, which you would see in most other countries. And this was fine for the time, but to the times they were changing. When they adopted the VZ52 rifle, they actually decided to put an integral bayonet that folded on the side. So if you look at it this way, it folded back in on itself. It's kind of like an M44 Mosin bayonet where it's hinged on the side. It's not like an SKS where it flips up on the bottom, or Type 56. But the VZ52 was not a particularly good rifle. It only had a 10-round magazine. At first it was in a proprietary 7.62x45 cartridge. Czechoslovakia was in the Warsaw Pact, so the Soviets pressured them to adopt their own 7.62x39 cartridge. And at first 52s were converted into that, the 52/57. But they needed a new rifle. They needed something that would be more modern, more like the Soviet AK. And so that came to be the VZ58. Now, this would make more sense if I took the bipod off, which is cool in its own right. And also it wouldn't have a red dot on it, but I'm leaving it on there. So then you have something like this. Well, they didn't just have old bayonets that they could transfer onto these rifles like some other countries could have done. So what do? Well, they have to come up with a new one. And what they came up with was this design. And everyone kind of recognized at the time that the bayonet was not something you were going to be using super duper often. It's not going to be your primary weapon for countering cavalry charges like it would have been in the past, which is why you saw these great big long sword bayonets like the 1907 US bayonet or the SMLE bayonet, which are huge. The trend kind of moved more towards having utility knives. So instead of 15, 11-inch long bayonets, you would have something more diminutive, like 7 inches. It's not exactly what this is because it's metric, but we're rounding because that number is easier. And it's recognized that you're going to have a lot of soldiers. That's another thing at the time. The Czechoslovak army was a conscript army. Every male, that is, of a certain age, between a certain age range, is going to serve in the army. So they would need to have a rifle, and that rifle would need to have a bayonet issued with it. But since they recognized the bayonet was not all that important, they didn't want to put a whole lot of resources into making them. They didn't want to have, forged or even billet these huge long swords with a lot of attention into them. So they came up with a design that was quite simple, but still fulfilled the needs of a bayonet. And so now we'll get into some of the common design characteristics of these bayonets, and then I'll go into each of the individual variations. So first off, of course, mounts to the rifle. Probably can't see it. Mounts to the rifle here up at the front, but, and here's a unique thing. Let's go with the 4. It mounts backwards compared to all other bayonets. You slide it on from the back. Now, I've tried to dig in and find some sources to explain why this was done, and I haven't found any. My best speculation is that this was done so that the soldier didn't have to put his hands in front of the muzzle while he was affixing the bayonet in case there was an accidental discharge, so he didn't lose his fingers. Obviously, no one else in the world has ever cared about that, but it's still reasonably strong. It'll still hold the bayonet on. And another thing, if you do have a VZ58 in this day and age, and you have one with a bayonet lug, be aware when you try to put one of these on, it's going to be really tight, especially if it's a new made Czech small arms one, because they put a coat of paint over the bayonet lug here, which as the military ones, they did not have a coat of paint over it. So when you first put it on, it's going to be really, really tight. You might even have to beat it on there, but once you wear that initial coat of paint off, then it'll go on easy peasy. In fact, some of mine, there's some variation to how easily they go on. Yeah, this one, it just slides on, no problem. But that's going to depend on your gun and the bayonet, because there is some variation in the size of those grooves for going on to the rifles. So now I'm going to put the rifle aside. I'm going to zoom in on bayonets, and then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty and progress through the timeline from the very first bayonets to the most recent one, the very last one. All right, now get ready, because we're going to go into some nitty-gritty details about these things regarding their manufacturer, and it was mostly about the manufacturer, because the design of the bayonets themselves stayed pretty much the same up until the most recent, the Gen 5, the BON, which we'll get to in due time. But the general design principles of the bayonet stayed pretty much the same throughout its whole life. You still have a roughly 7-inch blade out front. These are not sharpened. None of them were. And in fact, you will never find one that was issued that was sharpened, because they were issued blunt to prevent, injuries and to prevent the blades from getting dull and needing to be sharpened constantly. So the blades were only to be sharpened in the event of an actual war and a general mobilization. So until then, all of the bayonets were left dull. If you find one that's been sharpened, it's been sharpened by someone, previous owner after the fact, who wanted to actually use it as a knife. But I don't think these would make very good knives, because for reasons we'll get to in a bit. So we'll start with the first one, or one of the two first ones. This is, sorry about the light, this is what's called what we'll call a Gen 1 bayonet. As you can see, it has that 7-inch long blade. It does not have a cross guard for your fingers, so if you're holding it, there's nothing that's keeping your hand from sliding off onto the blade, especially when you're inserting it, or if you are fighting with it or using it for any real purpose. There's a little lip here, but there's nothing else that's keeping your hands from sliding off onto the blade. And there were actually injuries caused by this, and it's cause for a design change that we'll get to in a bit. It also has these solid wood, these are beech handles. This is also something that would change. Naturally, the furniture on VZ58s also started out as beech wood. In fact, I might as well just bring it up now. You'll see two different colors. There's a dark beech, which is stained, and then a lighter beech, which doesn't have any sort of stain on it, but it is finished. And so these were the very first bayonets that were produced. The tangs in these only comes out to, as what you can see, about here. Right about there it stops. I figured that was all that was necessary, especially because these wood handles are quite strong. Didn't really need anything, especially once they're riveted in place. Now the blade, the hilt, and the tang are all one piece. These are all one forged piece. This is also something that would change later down the line. Now the problem with these, well, there wasn't really any problems with them aside from just the cost. The forging, having to cut the wood grips and then rivet them on, that was a cost that the Czechoslovak government and the military kind of deemed to be unnecessary. And so the first upgrade that they did, the first upgrade that was done to the bayonets was to replace the solid wood grips. These are all one piece that were then slid and riveted on to the tangs. Was they replaced those wood grips with this formaldehyde resin, and it was actually wood pulp with this formalic resin to impregnate it and make it very strong. It is in fact the same material that is used on the furniture of the later and rest of the VZ58s. It is exactly the same material. But they kept the same design and manufacturing techniques for the blade, the tang, the lack of a finger guard, the button and latch. That was all the same, except also the grips were now made in two pieces. And now it gets to where I said that there was a unicorn I didn't have. Originally, the two halves of these resin parts, they were molded, and then they were bonded directly onto the tang. There are recesses underneath here. The grips would have had corresponding bosses on them to go into those recesses, and then the whole thing was just bonded together and held in with glue. This was a great idea. Ideally, it would reduce the cost of the bayonets a lot. You wouldn't have to have someone actually rivet them on. However, they found out very quickly that the conscription in Czechoslovakia wasn't particularly popular, as it wasn't in many places, especially the communist countries, and so the conscripts tended to abuse their equipment. The Soviet Union discovered this as well, and so rather than use these as knives or bayonets like their superiors intended, conscripts would just use them as a hammer and beat on whatever they thought needed beating on. So that resulted in a lot of broken grips. And so whenever they came across a bayonet with no rivets that was damaged in such a way from abuse, it would be repaired with new grips, but it would have 1, 2, or 3 rivets installed depending on who was doing it, the time period, so on and so forth. So that is why I have not been able to find any generation of bayonet that has no rivets in it. Is because basically all of them, if they were issued, they were broken, and then they were repaired. I thought I saw one place that was selling them, and I tried to request it, but I didn't get it. So that is just something I will have to live with not having for the time being. But this is the second generation with the same forged blade, tang, and hilt assembly, or not assembly, all one piece, but having the formalic, what's colloquially called beaver barf grips. But this still had the problem of the conscripts' fingers sliding off of the grips and onto the blades, like I mentioned, which did result in, even though these weren't sharp, it did result in some injuries from that. And the forging process for these blades and the tang assembly still was not cheap enough and was not being produced fast enough for the Czechoslovak military. So what they did was they switched processes for the blades and the hilt and tang assembly to what's called investment casting. If you're not familiar with that, that's basically where you take a wax model, put it into some kind of form, sand or wax or whatever, and you make a mold out of that, and then you pour your casting material into that mold. You can usually have like an apparatus of multiples of these things cast all at once, and then when you pour usually steel or aluminum, in this case steel, it burns away all of that wax material or whatever you happen to use. Sometimes it's styrofoam, and you get the desired shape that you get out of it. And this is very fast and it's very cheap. And for these bayonets being made out of cast material, even though it's not as it's not as strong as a forging, that's fine. These things aren't going to see that much use as actual knives anyway, so it didn't really matter to them. And so they switched to that, and then of course they finally added a finger guard, so that even if you press into something, I'm not going to stab my own hand, your fingers aren't as liable to slide off of the grips and onto the blade and hurt yourself. So that's nice. And they're still doing the formalic grips, although they still have the short tang. On some models it was extended a little bit to give some more support to the grips because they did still tend to crack. And also, I have examples of these now. As you can see, the variation in the repairs that were done. Sometimes if they came in, now the Gen 3s were still being made with the rivetless grips, but of course they had the same problems that the Gen 2s did in that they kept breaking. So, but there's some variation in the way that the repairs are done. Sometimes you have 1 rivets, 2 rivets, or 3 rivets. 2 rivets is the most common that you'll see. If you go online, you look for a VZ58 bayonet. The most common model that you see is this model that's cast with a finger guard and 2 rivets. It's somewhat less common to find 3 and 1 rivet models, but as you can see, they were done. The 3rd rivet here in the middle ended up being kind of superfluous, and you'll see in the next model it was standardized to just have 2. Now, speaking of the next model, this is the final iteration that was done under the communist government in Czechoslovakia, and really the only thing that changed in this model was they extended the tang all the way to the back and also had it come all the way to the edges of the grips. This is by far the strongest model of this bayonet. Even if you use it as a hammer, you're going to hit on the steel parts. It's still cast, but it doesn't matter. So the steel tang is now fully supporting all the grips, and they were all done with 2 rivets. I don't think I've ever seen pictures of a Gen 4 bayonet that had anything other than 2 rivets. None 1 or 3. I have not seen that. Now, something that I should mention regarding the castings is I have a couple different models of that. So you'll see, and actually this goes back farther, except for this one. Yeah, this one has it. So you'll see typically on the left side of the blade has these numbers stamped into it. I think you can see them there. And these are not serial numbers. Some people might think they are. They look like serial numbers, but they're not. These bayonets were never serialized to individual rifles. They were never matched. It didn't really matter to the Czechoslovak army whether they were or not. What these were, they're simply just registration numbers. They were done by the individual depots, whoever was organizing the bayonets and their issuance. And so these were just done to log the bayonets where they were, whether they need to be repaired, whether they were lost or whatever. This is just basically done as bookkeeping. But there was something that was done on the other side. It's a bit more interesting. I mentioned before that these was done in investment castings. And you can see here there's evidence of that. These are casting lock codes. And the way this was done, or the reason this was done, is so that you can keep track of the batches that were done. These were obviously done in batches. So if there was a problem with one, like there was a flaw, if there was porosity, you could trace it back to a lot of bayonets, pull them from service, and then replace them with ones that didn't have these problems. And the way you can read these codes is the first 2 digits are the week of the year that the casting was done, and then the last digit is the last digit of the year it was done. They didn't really worry about the years overlapping, I guess because they just didn't worry about it. They didn't see these being made for all that long. So these were probably made in the 70s, so 72 and 74 here respectively. This would have been, I guess, the last week of January, and I'm not going to do the math in my head, but that was much later in the year. Although sometimes you will find things like this Gen 4 don't have a casting code on them at all. And let me see if this one... Yeah, this is another Gen 3. The 1 rivet doesn't have a casting code on it at all. So there's no real consistency with how these were done. I don't think that there's any sort of pattern to what got these codes and what didn't. They pretty much all have these registration codes, but some of them, they don't have the casting lock codes. So now before I get into what happened to these bayonets after the fall of the communist government in Czechoslovakia, I want to go over the scabbards that were issued with these, because there's actually quite a variety of them, as you can see. We'll get into some of the post-communist use of the bayonets, obviously because of their scabbards, but can't help but spoil that. So the way that the bayonets were worn was they were worn on the front left of the soldier's belt. They just had a simple leather belt. It was pretty much exactly a direct copy of the German belts from World War II, except obviously the design stamped on the buckle was different, had a star instead of the Gotmütz and the eagle. And this was the first design of the scabbard that was issued with these bayonets. It's all leather. It has 5 rivets in these specific points, and then all stitched together. Has a bit of reinforcing at the tip, and it has a strap to keep the bayonet in place. So if I take this Gen 1, as it would have gone in there. And also, as I've discovered, the bayonets fit best with the button facing out, because otherwise the button is pushing into the leather and it stands the bayonet a bit proud of the scabbard itself, and it keeps you from doing the strap easily. So this is how it would have been worn. But this was not done for very long. In fact, this one was made in 1962. The design was tweaked a little bit, and it was done to this design where they added a 6th rivet here, whereas previously the leather was just folded over and stitched completely. Had this triangle of stitching here. This one doesn't. It just has the 3 rivets and no stitching up in this area, and this was cheaper. Riveting is obviously a lot faster to do than stitching leather. Stitching leather is a huge pain in the ass. And so this, as you can see, is quite well worn, and this was used for the rest of the communist government's life up until the 1990s, or mid-90s rather, until this was finally replaced. You see, this one was actually made in 1983. So this one, despite its rather short service life, saw quite a lot of use. Another extra thing that they made for these bayonets was this one, and this was made specifically for the chemical and biological warfare troops, as they were going to be going into areas that were contaminated with any kind of nerve agents, gas, nuclear fallout, that kind of thing. So rather than leather, which absorbed those kinds of agents and was really difficult to get them out afterwards, they issued them with these special rubberized, or just straight rubber scabbards, pardon me, and that were much easier to clean off of these toxic agents once they were ported back to their bases and they were stripped of all of it. And the VZ-58s that they were issued with also had corresponding magazine pouches that were made of the same material, although curiously they only held 1 magazine. Usually the pouches that Czechoslovak soldiers were issued held at least 2. The border guard pouches held 2. The army pouches actually held 4. But the chemical biological warfare pouches only held 1, which I thought was kind of curious. So skipping ahead in time a bit, we're going to get to the VZ-95 pattern. Obviously, when the communist government fell in Czechoslovakia, a little while later, the government wanted to get rid of their old communist-looking uniforms and adopt something new, so they adopted a somewhat modern camouflage pattern that was based off of the U.S. woodland pattern, although they changed the color slightly to better suit the Czech and Slovak terrain, because the 2 countries had split up by this time. And so I have 2 different designs of this bayonet scabbard, and they're both in the VZ-95 pattern, except one is made by SPM Liberec, and the other is made by Phoenix Protector, both in the Czech Republic. The differences are actually quite substantial. They both hold the same bayonet, Gen 4, because this is what it would have been used with. It has a Velcro strap and a snap button on it. And the Phoenix one has 2 snaps, and the wrap actually encompasses the entire, almost the entire grip. Now, what's interesting is the Phoenix Protector one is obviously meant to go on molly belts, whereas the SPM Liberec is made to go on the special Czech-made MNS 2000 system. It has this little tang that goes into loop belts, and at some point I may do a whole video on the MNS 2000 system, because it's actually pretty nifty and I have a bunch of it, so that might be something that I do in the future. And later, when the Czech government got involved, or got Article 5'd into the global war on terror, they were sending their soldiers to arid desert environments like Afghanistan. It's not all desert, but it has deserts. So they needed a desert pattern, and so they have a VZ-95 desert pattern. This is the SPM Liberec model, but it's exactly the same as the woodland one. It's just in the different colors. Curiously, it's a 2-color desert, desert pattern, whereas the VZ95 woodland is, I believe, it's 4 colors. So I simplified it, but it's a cool looking pattern. I have some more of it, and whenever I do that MNS 2000 video, I have a bunch of that gear as well. So stay tuned for that. So now finally the last bayonet that was issued with the VZ58 right at the end of its service life. This is sometimes called the Gen 5, sometimes called the BON, which in Czech is an abbreviation that I cannot remember, but it's basically just a fighting knife. And this is actually a knife. Unlike the previous generations of bayonets, these actually have sharpened blades, and they'll come like that from the factory. And it's somewhat of a departure from the traditional, quote-unquote, traditional design, but it has a lot in common with it. It still mounts exactly the same way, has the same style of latch, same style of button, although the construction is quite different. As you can see, the blade is thicker. It actually has an edge. It doesn't have the false edge on top that the original bayonets did. It just has one edge going along the bottom, and it has the serrations here that would be used for striking a fire starter, if I remember correctly. And the grips are no longer the formalic resin. They're actually good rubber grips that are actually molded such that they fit a normal human hand. They're actually quite large and quite comfortable. But the whole thing is still actually, no, it's not one piece anymore. You can see the remnants of welds here where the blade is actually welded on, but the grips are still one piece. They look to me to be cast, although I cannot confirm that. I don't have any literature on exactly how these were manufactured. These were not standard issue. These are commercial item, but they were purchased by at least one unit in the Czech army that went to Afghanistan, and they actually had that unit's logo engraved on the base of the blade here. The rest of the commercial ones that you find don't have that, obviously, because they weren't issued. After that, the VZ58 was phased out of service in favor of the Bren 805 and eventually also the Bren 2, and they have their own bayonet, which I could show off at another point, or actually I have shown off at a different point in my video regarding the differences between the 805 and the Bren 2. Whew. So that is the entire history of the VZ58 bayonet from start to finish. This video has been a long time coming. I kept putting it off because I wanted to make sure I had all the information that I wanted and I had all the bayonets I could get my hands on. Still wasn't able to get a hold of a rivetless one despite my best attempts. Oh well, maybe someday I'll get one. But yeah, this will have to do until I do get one. So thank you for watching. If you got this far, this video is probably pretty long by now. I should probably go inside before the sun sets and get some dinner. So peace out, Girl Scouts.